It's harder for me to talk to the sales side, but I've gotten really good at it, I think, just because I've been doing it for so long now. I love working with like my techie data scientists and data engineers. But when you go to a sales or business side, you have to think about it completely different. I have to really like change my mindset. I have to be careful like scheduling meetings too close together. I can't go from like directly talking to a data engineer and then 5 minutes later talking to a salesperson because it's gonna like mess me up. I need to like think about it before I go into that meeting. Like, how am I going to explain this without using technical jargon?
Christina, welcome back to the Ken's Nearest Neighbors podcast. This is technically your third appearance where, for the 50th episode, you actually interviewed me, which was a very fun experience. But today is all about you again. So it's been probably a little over a year, maybe a year and a half since we last spoke. And I'm excited to hear about what's changed in your life. I know offline we've talked about some very exciting things, and I'm excited to touch on some of those with you and just hear where you're at right now. Before we get into things, when I have someone live, I like to have them do a little introduction rather than me introducing them. So if you could, I'd love it if you would tell our wonderful listeners a little bit about yourself. What would you like them to know?
Of course. So my name is Christina Stathopoulos. I am a data voice, I would say. I'm very active in the data community. I work at Google, currently at Waze as an analytical lead. I also teach in higher education at a couple institutions, mainly at IE Business School and ISDI, which are both based in Madrid, Spain. And then as well, I do public speaking and podcasts and so on, but very active in the data field. And then I'm also the host of the Book a Week Challenge, which if you're not familiar with that, we can chat about it later. But you can also search for it on LinkedIn by putting hashtag Book a Week Challenge.
Well, we will definitely be talking about it later. So we're talking right now in beautiful Malaga, Spain.
Correct.
And I hope I pronounced it right. I've been working on it for the last entire week.
You're good.
But I'm super happy that we could do this. I'm first interested in perhaps what's changed since the last time that we talked.
Yeah, so the last time we talked, like a year and a half, I believe I was living in New York, or was I still in Madrid?
I think it was before you moved to New York.
Okay, so when we talked, I was living in Madrid, Spain, I think. In between that time, I moved back closer to home to New York City. I was living there for a year, and now just about a month ago, I moved back to Spain again across the Atlantic, and now I'm in Malaga. I think that's been the biggest change in my life because during that time, I've still kept my job at Google. I did change to Waze, it's true. I think when we spoke, was I at Waze already?
You were not, no.
Okay, so that's another big thing. I used to work like in core Google, Google Search, Google Ads, and now I changed over to Waze. And with that job also came a change of location. So relocated with my husband to New York City. And then we made the decision about a month ago to come back to Spain. And now we're in Malaga.
So what was behind, before we get into some of the more work specific stuff, I'm interested in what like the onus behind the decision to come back to Spain was. Obviously you spent a large portion of your life here, and after visiting, it is unbelievably beautiful, especially here. But I want to hear kind of in your words, what were some of the reasons that brought you back this way?
Yeah, it's complicated. For those that don't know, I am originally from the US, but I moved abroad to Spain right after graduating from college and spent 10 years in Madrid. Pretty much my entire like adulthood, my working life was in Spain. And then I had this idea, this picture that I wanted to go back to the US and continue developing my career there. And my husband and I found the opportunity to do that, and we took it. We went to New York City. And it just wasn't what we imagined, to be honest, for a lot of different reasons. But one thing could be that we were coming from the perspective of living in a European city, which we had gotten very much used to. And we love the European way of life and the European style big city. We moved to New York, and it's like an American city. And it has a lot of particularities that just wasn't for us. For some people it might be, but for us it just did not work at all. And also we made the decision as well to come back to Spain, to come to Malaga. And it's just this other style of life. Relaxed in a sense. I'm still like a very driven person. So I'll always be on top of my work and probably a very like busy person. But regardless of that, like it's a very relaxed style of life. It's beautiful, like you said. We just needed to come back to Europe. We needed a change of scenery, and New York didn't work for us.
Very understandable. I mean, I think a lot of the listeners, some are from Europe, some are from India, some are from the US, and a lot of us only have perspective of what it's like to live, for example, in an American big city or in a European big city. What are some of the differences of, for example, like a European big city versus a New York or a Chicago? I know at least for me, one of the like massively interesting things is the history and the age of things. Yeah. Right? We're like, oh, like some parts of New York are old, and it's like, this is like not really old. You go to places and you're like, that building's been here since like the 1400s in Europe, and you're like, the oldest one in some like traditional urban areas in the U.S. could be like 1900, right? And that for me is a fascinating difference. But what are some of maybe the other ones that are?
No, that's a big one. And along with that is like the beauty of the city. Some people like the concrete jungle of New York. And I did before in a sense, but now I realize like not to live in the concrete jungle, but maybe to come and visit or see it from afar. It's fine. But because of that like history, the architecture, like the beauty of Europe, you can go to all these different cities across Europe and they're all different and the buildings just have so much I don't know what it is, but that style and that history behind it, I think it's beautiful. Whereas in the US, well, you have concrete buildings that have been there for maybe 50 years or 60. So that's different. I think other things as well is like the like American way of life is very much within your car. You always move from one place to the next with a car. And the cities and the infrastructure was mainly built with the car in mind. New York is probably the least, like the farthest from that. It's true that like New York has tried to be adapted to not necessarily like need a car. You can live in the city without a car. You can take the bus and the subway and so on. But it's still like not very, there's definitely room for improvement, and they're not at the level of like Europe. But Europe was built like with you move by foot. Like that's how it is in your head. A lot of people live in the city without a car. That's normal. I lived in Madrid for 10 years. I never had a car. I didn't need one. I also lived in New York without a car, and it's true I didn't need it, but if I wanted to leave the city, I did. I was pretty stuck unless I flew somewhere and then rented a car. So you feel like a little bit trapped. So there's this big difference between like car versus moving by foot and public transportation. And I got so used to that and I prefer it. Like it just seems so much healthier. It's better for the environment. It has a lot of benefits. And I just didn't want to go back to like feeling so trapped that I need this vehicle, this car to move around. So I think that's one thing I noticed. I'm trying to think of other things.
I know for me, one of the big ones is that like pre-pandemic, I think a lot of people felt that you have to be in these big urban areas to advance your career.
For sure.
That's something that's like, oh, I'm not around these other people. I'm missing out. I'm falling behind, whatever it might be. And post-pandemic, I personally feel like that's a lot less.
Yeah.
Like I feel like through the internet, through communities, through whatever it might be, it's a lot easier to get in touch with and stay in touch with other people that are like-minded, and also meet new people completely online or through meetups or whatever it might be. Whereas before, there's a lot more focus on like a social life, a nightlife where you're connecting with your peers or your work peers or whatever it might be. That has been a massive factor in me moving out of these urban areas because, I was in Chicago before. I love the city, but I couldn't really go outside. Like I'm the biggest wuss when it comes to cold weather, and I couldn't go outside. And
I forgot to mention that about New York. The cold is not for me either.
It's very temperate here, which is unbelievable. Actually, there's a lot of it's significantly more urban here, but I feel a lot of similarities like culturally to Hawaii, which is very cool.
That's nice.
But yeah, has that played a reasonable role in like
in moving?
Yeah.
I think it has, actually. It's good that you bring that up. I think this like now that we can do so much remote, it's not necessary that you need to be in like the big city to have all the opportunities. I think that's happening in a lot of places in the US and in Europe. You're seeing it happen. So it's not like one or the other for sure. I did imagine like being in New York, I would have more career opportunity, and for sure you do. You have so much there, but I think nowadays it's true. Like with remote work and so many opportunities, and dispersed teams, location doesn't matter. You don't need to be in New York, and I did realize that as well. I knew like no matter where I go, I think I'll be able to make something work, and with so many opportunities online, it's just of course. And then as well, making the move that I did to Malaga. So we picked a smaller city, actually. We were in Madrid, which is like 6 million. It's a big city in Spain. And then, of course, New York is huge. We made the decision to come to Malaga and actually go to something a little bit smaller, take it a step back. But part of that decision was because like we think we're going to still have opportunity. We're not limiting ourselves just because we're going to a smaller place.
Yeah. Oh, I think, something that is super in line with that also is that your like career choice and some of the things that you're doing even outside of work with speaking or teaching, a lot of companies fly you places to teach or to talk or to do any of these things. And so you sort of built in this channel that allows you to go to those hubs and still network and connect. And I felt, especially when I travel to different places, since I'm only there for a short period of time, people are more inclined to actually see me, more inclined to do things, like opportunities come to me more than me having to search them out, which is a very different way to map that equation of networking and career progress. And I think that when people see, essentially both of us move somewhere that's far away from a more traditional like hub, they're looking at it without bringing all those other extracurriculars into the equation, which for us makes it very manageable. It's probably not for everyone, but it is a lifestyle or like a type of career environment that you can build over time. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's really cool to see that those other opportunities sort of mesh together to make it the best of both worlds, in my opinion.
For sure. And me, like in my case, because I do a lot of work in like universities, a lot of the universities, a lot of the work is done out of the big cities in Spain. Malaga is not a small city by any means, but it's not Madrid or Barcelona. So I'll sometimes have to go there to give a class or give a talk, and they'll send me there. But because I'm making that effort to go and people know I'm going to be there for 3 days or 1 week, then it's like you said, like people will make more of an effort to meet up with me. And I, on the other hand, do too. I'll like seek out people that I need to meet with, that I want to talk with, and I'll take advantage of those trips. And whenever I'm in those cities, I'll be taking advantage like to the full potential that's possible during my time there. So yeah, I'm still not even, I would say I'm not missing like the in-person contact either, because I'm going to get it. And we don't need to always be with our teams. I mean, nowadays, even with you working remote, you might be working in the same city as your team, but maybe you're not seeing them but once a week or once a month. So even us living in these more isolated places, we're not necessarily that much more isolated than people who live and work in the same
a block
city.
Away.
Yeah.
I think that there's a commercial for like the Oculus or something, where the people are playing and they're like right next door, but they don't realize it. And like one of them's like, hey, keep it down. And they like don't realize
that,
but it can be sort of like that, where it's like, you're actually closer to the people than you think like without the proximity being there. I mean, like you could be across the world and be closer with this person in a room than the person who literally lives right next door to them.
Well, and we've made a friendship, and you're all the way in Hawaii. And now I'm here in Spain. So we're like on opposite sides
Probably
of the world.
the furthest you can get, if I had to guess.
Pretty much, yeah.
12-hour time difference.
Yeah.
So just a quick transition. Obviously, we're talking about changing locations, but since the last time we talked, you're now in a different role, which is, if I remember correctly, an analytical lead.
Correct.
I'm interested in what the nature of that role is like. We've had tech leads, we've had engineering leads on the show. How is an analytical lead different from perhaps those, or maybe even a more traditional data science job?
Yeah, I first of all will make the caveat that like every company has their own interpretation of what's behind a job position. Even when you look at like even the traditional job of like a data analyst, data scientist, data engineer, I even see within different companies responsibilities kind of like blurry, even across those three. So what I'm saying is more from my experience, recognizing that it can be very different in other places. But so in my case, analytical lead. So what I've been doing, and I was doing something similar in Google before and now doing it in ways, but I've always been working close to the monetization of the product, which is through ads in this case, online advertising, digital advertising. And as an analytical lead, I'm working very closely with the sales team. And you can think of me like a tech person on the sales team, but I'm creating this bridge and this connection between sales and the business side with the technical and data side. So I am a hands-on worker, like I'm pulling and doing my own analyses and projects and things. And I lead data strategy and data projects myself. So pulling in all of the capabilities that we have from the data side, connecting it to sales, bringing it to our business stakeholders and our clients, and using that data to power decisions, to guide their strategy, whether it be for advertising or even on a whole, like a business strategy. But really it's like this translator / connector role. And I think it's very unique just because of the place that you sit, because I'm in like this middle space. I do work very closely with the sales team. I go directly with clients. I meet with clients, and it could be business like leads with the client, or I could be meeting with like their data scientists, their data engineers. And then at the same time, I come back and I'm meeting with our data scientists, even our data engineers. And there'll be projects of my own that become more complicated. I can pull in resources from a data scientist or data engineer to help me, and we can partner together on a project as well.
That's really cool.
I think it's a very like odd placed position. I think it's incredibly valuable, and it's something that I extremely enjoy just because of the fact that you get to work with so many different teams that are very different in what they're working on. Just comparing like a pure business salesperson with a data engineer, completely different like spectrums, perspectives of the business, but you got to act as like that connector. Love what I do. I think it's incredibly interesting. And I don't know, I assume it exists in other companies, but it might go by different names. And I think it's an incredibly valuable position for a company to have them.
This episode is brought to you by Z by HP, HP's high compute, workstation grade line of products and solutions. Z is specifically made for high performance data science solutions, and I personally use the ZBook Studio and the Z4 workstation. I really love that Z workstations can come standard with Linux, and they can be configured with the data science software stack. With the software stack, you can get right to work doing data science on day one without the overhead of having to completely reconfigure your new machine. Now back to our show.
So what do you think maybe one of the most important or some of the most important core skills of your work versus someone that's more traditionally on the engineering side would be? Yeah.
So, and this, I'm going to say from my experience again, with that caveat that it can differ in other companies. So when a few years ago, before Google, I was a data engineer with Nielsen, the market research company. And then I've also worked with, even during my time at Google, I've worked with data scientists, I've worked with data engineers. What's the difference that I've seen? Well, especially in my time at Nielsen as a data engineer, usually data engineers are a lot more like, I guess you would call it back office. So they're very technical, very technically savvy. They're working with the raw data. They're preparing the dashboards, the databases. They're making sure that pipelines are running and things like this, but they're very much entrenched in the data all day. Whereas in my case, yes, I'm very much entrenched in the data, but maybe like 50% of my time. The other 50% is spent talking to sales leads, talking to clients, building out pitches in partnership with sales, working on projects. But I think that's the main difference that I see is like how close you sit to the sales team and the business side, and also the fact that you have to look at everything from a business perspective. Whereas as a data engineer, I looked at everything like from the data side, just technically speaking, not ever thinking like, what does this mean for the business? What could we do differently to improve things for the business? So yeah, I have to have it always with a sales business perspective, which actually is difficult for me. I like to be more technical, so I have to push myself to think of everything from the business side. But that's what you have to do in that position. And then just the fact that you're client facing. So you have to be like ready to give presentations, and you have to know how to explain what you're doing with data to somebody who maybe has very little experience working hands-on with data. So it's very different when you talk to a data engineer about your project versus when you present that project to like the sales lead.
How hard is that to switch between? When you described it like, oh, I've talked with data scientists and data engineers on my team, on the other person's team, on the other company's team, and then also their salespeople. I mean, that would be a very interesting challenge, I would imagine.
It's harder for me to talk to the sales side, but I've gotten really good at it, I think, just because I've been doing it for so long now. I love working with like my techie data scientists and data engineers. But when you go to a sales or business side, you have to think about it completely different. I have to really like change my mindset. I have to be careful like scheduling meetings too close together. I can't go from like directly talking to a data engineer and then 5 minutes later talking to a salesperson, because it's gonna like mess me up. I need to like think about it before I go into that meeting. Like, how am I going to explain this without using technical jargon?
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so what do you think would help data people if they're trying to communicate with salespeople? Like, what should data people know about salespeople, essentially?
I mean, first of all, don't make assumptions that they are going to understand what you're talking about. I mean, you got to think about it like you're talking to somebody who has zero experience with data. So the first thing is just being very careful with the wording you're using. You need to break it down like very, very simple. And you also don't want to, you don't want to go into the details they don't care about. They don't care about the tools that you're using, probably. They don't want to hear about your data pipeline is broken. Like, they just want to know, they want you to get to the point that is relevant for them, which is like the connection to the business. What does this mean for the business? And only the things that are like relevant to that conversation. You don't need to pull in the technicalities. But yeah, for me, it's more like whenever I'm going to have this conversation, I really try to make the effort of putting myself in their position and trying to think just through their eyes, how they are seeing this. They're not coming in with like the perspective that we might have. We understand like how the data architecture works and where all the data sits and what this model means, or et cetera. But yeah, it's completely changing your viewpoint, putting yourself in their shoes. That's what I do. I do that in teaching too, but we can talk about that in a little bit. But even when I'm teaching others, what I try to do is put myself in their position based on the knowledge that they have. What are they going to be able to understand, and how can I bring it to their level so they can connect with me?
And so it's, it seems like it's a lot about thinking about what their goals are. So,
Yes.
My goal is to make the sale, to use our budget, to do whatever it might be. And that is not the goal of a data scientist or a data engineer. Your goal is like, oh, I want this system to be reliable and scalable, and I want to produce good and consistent results. It's not about these one-off things. In one of my talks, I talk about how business people, I guess it applies to salespeople as well, but also engineers, they come at stories from the opposite ends.
Yeah.
Right? Like business people, it's essentially like, tell me the end first. Like, what is the outcome? And if the other stuff is relevant, maybe tell it to me. But it's mostly like, I need to do some action. Tell me what I should do. And the engineering or the data science mindset is like, we tell the story from the beginning to the end. It's like, we built this infrastructure so we don't have these mistakes. But also the liability is on us if we don't tell the story from the beginning to the end. So if we don't give you the caveats and all the problems with what could happen, then it's on us if things go wrong. And so there's this like really weird misalignment of incentives when these two groups talk to each other. And it's really cool that you're in that specific role that you are, because it kind of absolves the blame from both of those parties.
It is it can be a really tough. I was going to say, like, when something goes wrong, you don't want to be in this position. Yeah. Because now you've got to explain, like, I don't know, there's some failure within your data. How do you explain that to the business side? Because they don't care. Like, they just want their result. Yeah. You can't deliver on time, and it's because there's been a crash. You can't access the data. I don't know. They don't really want to hear that, and you've got to find a way to like mediate between both sides. So it gets tough in those moments because one side versus the other just doesn't really understand. But that's what this type of position is for, is to like maintain this communication between both and this balance. And yes, sometimes you will get blamed and you have to learn how to deal with that.
So how do you deal with that, just personally?
This is I'm still growing, still trying to figure out how do you deal with this. It's really tough. Like I will have like a lot of complaints from sales. I'll understand, like, let's say like they have a list of needs. They need this, they need this. And I'll understand like from a data view, what can we do? What can we not do? For those that is feasible possibly, then I need to maybe talk with like our data engineers. How can we pull in this data, start storing this, start building out this infrastructure? But I'll like communicate all of this and pull it back to maybe our data engineers. And they'll come back to me and say like, no, we can't, we can't do this. And then I've got to go back to sales. There's like this back and forth. I think that the key to it all, that back and forth, is like trying to really dig down and understand each side's perspective. So when you really break down like what sales wants, like, okay, but why? Why do you need this? Why do you want to do this? What's the end goal? What is, in this case, working with sales, what's your like estimated revenue impact? What do you think you can get out of this? When we really start to ask questions, some of those wants or needs might disappear, or we might see that they're not worth the effort, especially if we're talking about like revenue. Is this like a small little win that you really want it, but it's really not worth it for the business. We need to cut it out of priorities. So anyway, you can really like get down to the point when it comes to the business, understand the full, really what they're asking for. And then that's on the business side. For the data engineers as well. For me, that's been tougher to work with sometimes, but in my case, when I'm working with data engineers or data scientists, they have bandwidth. I mean, there's things they can do, and then there's things that just don't. We need to get it within their pipeline. So in a lot of those cases, like if I'm bringing needs from business and sales to data engineering, usually we'll go through literally like a prioritization process, and they're going to have to pick like what we can and cannot do. And then from this prioritization process, I'll go back to sales and be like, sorry, we couldn't get this prioritized. We just don't have the bandwidth for whatever it may be. I don't know if this is making sense.
No, it makes a ton of sense. So it seems like, to me, when you're dealing with challenges for the engineering or the data scientist teams, it's like a project management problem almost completely, right?
I think it all comes down to project management. But I think it's definitely project management. Even on the business side, it is. But the business side, what I like to do is always like ask a lot of questions to understand why they really want to do something and what's the end goal to help them. Because you have to remember that like the business sales side is not going to understand the effort behind their asks. You are there to understand what they want and then try to deduce what it's going to take on like a resources and data, what it's going to take to get there. And you got to like bring them to reality, like to make them understand like this is not a simple ask. It sounds like a simple ask to you, but what's behind it is very complicated, and it's going to cost more for the business than what the business is going to get out of it.
Yeah, and I think to your point, a lot of the time the business side, they don't know what they don't know. So there might be an easier solution that answers their like big pie in the sky question or problem that they don't even think is feasible. They're like, oh, I didn't even know you could do that. And I've been trying to do this shortcut and this shortcut and this shortcut and asking for this engineering ask, which seems easy to me, but actually it's easier to engineer the other thing. And like everyone wins, but you don't get to there without eliciting or like without asking these questions, and you elicit them through that. So
that's true.
I look at it as like, or it seems like it's this like project management for engineers, and then it's almost like a consulting or like a needs elicitation for a sales side where you're like kind of selling them in some sense as well, which is really
you summarized
cool.
it much better than me. I don't know how to summarize it. But
I'm just regurgitating what you were describing. So what I also think is really cool is you get essentially to do this role with your teaching as well. So you're teaching at an MBA program, and you're working with business students constantly. And so you're getting extra exposure on this side. What have you noticed about teaching business students? Like, obviously we're talking about value and thinking about the business first, but are there any other things that are that stand out to you in maybe the way they communicate or the way that they approach technical concepts?
Yeah, and I think I alluded to this before, that like a lot of the work that I do, working with these cross-functional teams at work, it reminds me also of working in the MBAs, which is like a cross-functional group of students, because some are engineers. They might come from engineering background and now they're doing an MBA, or you have like pure business people, sales, etc. So working with them, I absolutely love it because you're working with a very diverse crowd. What's the perspective that they take on things? A lot of times because they're doing this MBA, like obviously they are very focused on business. I mean, that's what they're there to study anyway. But when we're talking about technical subjects, they tackle everything from the business side. Something that has always, like traditionally for me, been difficult to do. It's not my natural reaction. Whereas for them it is. They look at everything from a business lens, which is great. But what I need to do when I'm teaching these classes that are more technical topics, but my classes are technical adapted for a business environment. So always with a connection to the business, and we don't go too deep, but deep enough. And my goal, like as their professor, as their teacher, is to make a connection with them, to make sure that I'm allowing them to understand all of this business knowledge that they have. How does it connect into what the capabilities and the features of the technology and the data are? So trying to find this way to make the connection. My experience with MBAs, at least where I teach, is that they're like very eager to learn, especially about technological topics, because they realize like how important it is today. Nobody can disregard the importance of technology and everything that we do, and especially data. So they're very, very eager to learn, and they are just like absorbing knowledge from me. And they seem very much like motivated to understand. This has at least been my experience, but they've been very motivated to understand, and they usually quickly understand the meaning for their business, if I can make that connection.
So I started, one of my master's degrees is in global business, and I started as a business person. I did that before any computer science or anything technological. And I remember very distinctly that I would always have these like pie in the sky ideas, like, oh, let's do this. And when it came to implementation, I eventually found that it was impossible or difficult.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, and when I was doing my computer science degree, I would like consult with some of the business school students, and it's like, hey, we have this idea, like, how do I build it? Like, let's build it. And I'd have to be like, that is literally impossible with the tools and technologies that we use today. And, you know, I would say that I almost began to like resent that area of my life where it's like, none of this is grounded in reality to a certain extent. And like, I was really grateful for my background, like bringing those two together, where it's like, oh, there's a business or there's an idea. It has to be grounded in something quantifiable. It has to be grounded in some form of engineering. Like, can we build it? Does this technology exist? Is that part of like what you're responsible for articulating to students, is like, hey, like you might want to do this, but we have to see if it's even feasible to begin with?
Yes and no. I mean, to some degree, yes. But at the same time, I like to encourage them. Like, these pie in the sky ideas are not always a bad thing. I mean,
I would agree.
They're definitely like, we need that because we need like innovation, and there's got to be somebody that says this wild idea that becomes a reality. I mean, for sure, the first people that talked about self-driving cars or voice assistants, everybody was like, you're crazy. But eventually it happens. So I do like these pie in the sky ideas. But yes, during my classes, I will show them like, okay, this is the extremes of where our technology is arriving, but it's true to get there. The companies that have done these incredible advancements, like they've done incredible things to get there. It's taken a lot of resources, a lot of talent. You're not just going to build this overnight. So I like to motivate them, but at the same time, have them realize like what it might take to bring these dreams to reality, and to show them that like some of the technologies though can be used, or a combination of technologies can be used to do some pretty cool things. You don't have to get all the way to this crazy idea, but maybe there's a midpoint that you can get in a reasonable timeline with the technology that we have today and with the resources that you have at your disposal.
I completely agree. I think one of the biggest eye-opening things to me was like the iterative process, and realizing and thinking about like every startup that I can think of. I mean, like let's take Uber, for example. It didn't start with what it is now. I don't think that they had even envisioned it to be what it is now. But it slowly grew over time. The technology scaled. It evolved into what it is. It didn't start as like the idea of what it is, or I would imagine it didn't. I didn't think that like when they started out, they're like, oh, we'll have anyone can pick up their car and drive anyone around. That to me is like probably outside of their even wildest expectations when they started. But they started with this thing and they built on it. They like let the market feed and guide the process for innovation. And to me, that's something that was like completely revolutionary in how I thought about anything. What is the kernel of an idea, and how do you build it and iterate on it and get data and feedback and build that into it? And I think that's something that they're starting to teach significantly more in business schools. But it is fundamentally more of an engineering mindset than a business mindset traditionally. And I think it's fun that those two things are starting to come together more.
Yeah, and I find in my classes, especially with MBAs, I think some of the most interesting people to work with in those MBAs are the ones who did come from an engineering background, because they do really quickly understand like the limitations, but they're trying to tackle things now from the business side, so they can come at it from two ways. Yeah. And this is a really
I'm sure their partners think they're buzzkills, but
yeah, but they're the most like realistic. They really know what's going on. And I think this is an incredibly powerful profile to have, somebody who can understand the technical side and attack it from a business side.
Yeah, that is really one of the cool things about business school too, is in theory you can come from any discipline. You can be a teacher, you can be someone who is like studying biochemistry, and you get the same benefits of like an engineer, right? If you're building a product or you're working at a company who is focused on serving teachers better, there's inside knowledge, there's that specialist understanding they can tell you is what's feasible or what's not feasible. I don't want it to seem like engineering is this mystical thing that trumps business in any way, shape, or form. It's that unique experience, it adds value to everyone else from like the diversity of backgrounds. And you know, your situation I think is really cool because you're teaching at an international business school, and you have people not just from different backgrounds in what they were working in, but also geographically tremendously. Can you tell me a little bit about what are the implications of that? And obviously there's a lot of positive things, but I would imagine there's probably some negative drawbacks that people who have gone to more homogeneous programs and universities might not be familiar with.
Yeah, so the business school that I teach at, particularly IE Business School, it's very international. The programs, I mean, I can have an MBA class with people from 30 countries easily sitting in on that class, all in the same room together, all with these wildly different backgrounds. Working with this type of group definitely took me some getting used to, because it's very unique. But this is going a little bit off topic, but just to connect it a bit, this experience teaching in such a uniquely international background of people has helped me a lot in work too. I always make a ton of connections between my work and teaching that both kind of bounce off of each other, and I'm learning things that I can apply one to the next. Teaching in such an international environment is also really helpful in the business world of today, because a lot of teams and companies are more and more international. So the experience that I have in the classroom, I feel like it's something I can export into my experience working in a corporate scenario. So anyway, working with all of these cultures, I think it's something that takes some getting used to, because you have to learn how to respect everyone at the same time and address people in the way that you should. Cultures come just from such different backgrounds. You have some cultures that will be a lot more like vocal during class, and a lot more they'll speak up more, whereas you have others who come from a culture where they're just shyer, or they come from an environment where they are a lot more like maybe it's in a sense like respectful of the teacher. They put them at like on a pedestal almost, and they don't want to interrupt your teaching, and they are quiet and they just want to listen and absorb, whereas others will be raising their hand and debating. And it's not like one way or the other is better or worse. But you have to learn to manage a classroom that's so diverse and manage it as well. Like if there's somebody that keeps speaking up, you need to learn how to like give others also a chance to have a voice at the table. And this is something that could happen in business too, where you have somebody who's always sharing their ideas, and the rest of the meeting, the rest of the business meeting, others aren't getting a chance to share their voice. The same thing happens in the classroom. Trying to think of other things, but yeah, it's just, I don't even know how I could put it into words. It's just things that I've naturally learned how to like command a classroom with people who are so different. And it's all about like respect of them so that they respect me. Azrael, really important, I think this would also translate to business, is like having command of the room, being very much in control of the room. This would be applicable if you're like running a business meeting. Then you need to have a plan, you need to have an agenda, you need to come across as confident with a smile. And I do the same thing in the classroom. It's very important that I command the classroom from minute one, because if not, I'll get eaten alive by the students. Let's be honest, this is an MBA class. So
how do you do that? So something that I think a lot of people forget about MBA programs is that almost everyone has some previous work experience. They're all adults,
yes.
right?
Yes.
It's not like a more traditional, even master's program where people are coming from undergrad and they're just students. Like these people have real world experience. How do you essentially like create a system of respect in that scenario? Whereas it's sort of built into the other types of master's degrees where you're like, I'm the teacher, you're the student. In this case, like you're all essentially in some sense peers because they have worked in the workforce.
Yeah.
What's your approach to that?
Yeah, and so a lot of times as well, they're around the same age as me. It's not like I have 10 or 20 years more of experience than them. No, we're pretty even many times. So how do I do that? I would say one thing is it's more like an aura that you give off, your attitude. But this is why it's important from minute one that you come in with a command of the room, that you show confidence, and just the attitude that you project, confidence in the subject that you're going to be teaching. This is something that I learned with time. I have no idea how to explain it in words, but it's just like the way that you present yourself from that moment, the moment you start, and that you don't give off a sense of like shyness or that you're not confident in what you're speaking about, because they'll pick up on it really fast. So you have to be careful with that. The other approach that I have, and this is more like incorporated into the entirety of my class, especially when I'm working with an MBA group, is that in my classes, I try to incorporate a lot of debate. I try to ask them a lot of questions and keep them very much involved. This is actually true for all of my classes. I try to be like a very dynamic environment, but particularly for MBAs, they like debate. They like to share their own opinions. And I also like to hear their opinions, because if we're talking about something, I might have zero experience in, let's say, retail. And I have quite a few people who have years of experience in retail, and they might have something to add to the conversation that we're having. So I want to encourage them to add it. So I think this helps as well. I build like a very open environment. I try to make it like open in the sense that I encourage everyone to speak up, not just have one or two that are always talking. Try to make it a very comfortable, open environment and get the whole classroom involved. And I think they appreciate this too, just because I'm not there to like tell them this is how it is and that's it. No, like this is a learning experience for everyone. And I also want to pull in all of your tidbits of experience into this classroom, and let's add it all together to my knowledge to come to some conclusions together.
I like that a lot. I think that a lot of people forget that you can practice authority. You can practice how you speak. You can practice your mannerisms. And you naturally do that if you're speaking a lot, if you're teaching a lot, if you're doing these things. But some people, you're like, okay, Ken, don't hear this often, but some people will say like, hey, you're a good speaker, you're so confident, or whatever it might be. It's like, no, I've practiced this. I have on video hundreds of hours of me talking. I mean, that's something that I can use. It's not like I don't watch it. I see the things that I don't like what I do. I see sometimes when I'm like, oh, I was really awkward there. I don't want to be in that situation again. I don't want to use that type of mannerism again. I can see, okay, the speech pattern that I'm using, I'm using too many filler words. I don't sound confident with this. I can slow it down and I can come off more authoritative. And there's pretty good science, though. There's a bunch of books. One is called Captivate. I really like. It's by this woman. I think her name is Vanessa Van Edwards.
I would love to read a book that puts into words what I tried to do.
Oh, it's really good.
Yeah.
This one's good. And then there's a couple other ones where it's just like, hey, this is how you convey authority or respect or get people to like you or whatever it may be. There's like eye contact and those types of things are
eye
really
contact
important.
is important. Yeah.
And I've really, I love the science and quantifying those types of things. So it's like, okay, I think for a lot of engineers, and I've talked about this with a couple people before, but a lot of engineers don't realize that you can quantify these things. They seem so foreign and like fuzzy that it's like, oh, I'd rather focus on the things that I can clearly see results in. But once you make it quantifiable, once you make it a system and a science, it starts to become really fun and interesting. And just breaking that barrier down is something that I think it's fun to hopefully help other people be able to do.
I haven't quantified all of this. That's what I need to do. In this case, I didn't. And I thought of one more thing that I think helps as well. Making an extra effort to try to learn each and every person's name, which is hard, and I don't do it with 100% success, not even close. But I also feel like the students really appreciate it when you address them by name. And I'll say, oh.
Get some name tags for everyone.
They do. Usually they're supposed to put a name tag.
Yeah,
but I mean without even looking at the name tag. Nice. To be able to recognize somebody walks in the room and you say, good morning, David. Like, I feel like they also appreciate that you've taken the time to be able to pick them out from a crowd. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
I make that extra effort, and I think it makes a difference. I think that students appreciate that too.
Yeah, that's one of the first things in, I think it's How to Win Friends and Influence People, is remember, people love hearing their name, I think is one of the first things.
That's what I'm doing. I just haven't quantified all this, but I know the little things that I do, and they seem to work. So.
Well, I have brought up 2 books just now, and books have clearly been a very large part of your life. You're super involved with the Book a Week Challenge, and I'm interested if you could tell me a little bit more about what that entails.
Yeah, the story behind the Book a Week Challenge.
Yeah, and what it means to you, of course.
Yeah. Well, it comes, first of all, from my love of books. I've loved books since I was a child. Used to read crazy amounts of books as a child. Kind of left it a bit in college, typical, doing other things. Then I picked back up this habit of reading as an adult. And the Book a Week Challenge itself started as like a personal goal for myself to try to read more. And I started posting about it because there's one thing that they say with habits: if you share it publicly, it'll make you feel more accountable. So I started sharing about the books I was reading. And then what I decided was to create this challenge to make it into a community effort. So to push others to do the same. And in the end, it's to foster a continuous learning mindset. That you need to always be in this mode of learning. I think it's incredibly important when you're working in tech and data, because this world is constantly changing from one night to the next. The technology is obsolete in no time. So you have to get into this mode of always learning and updating your knowledge. In my case, the way that I do it, the easiest is through books. And just love books. And I read all sorts of books, though. So I don't want to give the impression that I'm reading a book about data every week, because I'm absolutely not. Maybe once a month. But I'm reading all sorts of books just to expand my knowledge of the world, expand my knowledge of other ideas and other perspectives. And a bonus for me is that I only read paperback books. So it's also something I use to disconnect from screens. So I can put down the phone, get away from my laptop, and go with a physical book and read.
That's awesome. I'm very much the same, that I only read paperback books. It's a nice escape. I probably read, I'm like a big self-help guy.
Which is like the opposite of me. I don't read that much self-help.
Oh, I love it. Just like understanding the human condition to me is fascinating. So one of my friends, his name's Jeff Lee. He's also an avid reader. And we talk a lot about this concept of Quake books. I forget who the guy who originated this idea, but it's essentially a book that shakes your existence or how you view the world or how you think about a specific subject area. Do you have any Quake books?
Yeah, and and it's hard for me to think of all of them. I know that there's been so many moments where I'm reading a book or finishing a book and I'm just like, wow, has a big impact on me. I read a lot, so I would say it happens quite often. But some of them that come to mind, so I love sci-fi. Anybody that follows me for the Book a Week Challenge probably knows that my favorite genre is sci-fi. If really I did what I wanted, I would read sci-fi every week, but I try to avoid and have a little bit more diversity. So within sci-fi, there's these two books that for me were very much like, wow. So one of them is Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky, I believe is his name. And it's about, it's very much this like deep sci-fi where humanity goes to another planet and they run into another form of intelligence. In this case, it's in the form of spiders, but they're like intelligent spiders. They have developed intelligence in another way than we have. And it sounds like way out there, but these types of books for me, and especially sci-fi, because it's like dreaming of what could be. And I think it can inspire and innovate a lot within tech and data, and AI for sure. And in this case, it's an entire story about like this other intelligence. Why are we so fascinated by human intelligence when there can be other types of intelligence? Why are we basing artificial intelligence on human intelligence when it could be based on another type or a mix of intelligence? For example, a very common one that people speak about is swarm intelligence with bees or ants. What can we learn from their type of intelligence, and how could we incorporate that into the artificial intelligence of the future? So I think this book was just fascinating for me. And then another one, or do you have any comments about that?
Oh, no, that's super fascinating to me. Just reading, there's a lot about how, for example, like forests and like there's like a tree network and mushrooms that all communicate, and there's like a problem with them being disrupted because there's this whole vast network of essentially intelligence that all communicates. Yeah.
Oh, there's a lot underneath the earth.
And there's so much that we don't understand about how that works and the implications of that. And we were talking a little bit offline about how in Hawaii there's like ants everywhere, and sometimes they get on my counter and they just like, if I leave any sweets out, they always find it. And so I was like, I had a cold a while ago and I was eating a lot of honey, like putting it in my tea, and you leave one drop of honey out and magically there's thousands of ants there. And just thinking about how ants, for example, like traverse a counter and search, I have to imagine that the like search algorithm that has been encoded into them through evolution is probably pretty good, because they always seem to find the honey. Maybe it's some smell or pheromones as well, but it's always interesting to me, like watch the pattern that they go around just hunting for things. And it's not like they're smart enough to like think about the approach that they're taking. It's like built into their species or to their genes of searching in a specific way. And it's evolved like that over time. That's like intelligence, non-traditional intelligence that's probably more advanced than a human would go about doing it. Just like, oh, Ken, like you're in a maze and your eyesight's not that good. How do you find like something to eat? Like, I don't know, I just wander around in circles or do something stupid, right?
Yeah.
So I completely resonate with that. And it's so cool to think about other ways life has evolved intelligently. And I'm definitely going to take a look at that book.
Yeah, and not, you talked about the trees, the ants and bees, for example, and what we don't even know could exist that we're not aware of. But I can imagine there's tons of different ways that intelligence can develop. So I think, anyway, reading stories like these can really open your imagination, and I think they can have messages rooted in the reality of today to help inspire us for what's next. And then another book as well, going back to sci-fi, but this one is Aurora by Kim Stanley Robinson. And this is a sci-fi about like intergalactic travel. So on a ship traveling many light years away, traveling so far that multiple generations of people are born and die on that ship until they're going to get to their final destination. But what's interesting about the book, besides as well this idea of having multiple generations on a ship, which was really eye-opening too. But the main thing that I loved was that a lot of the book was told through the perspective of the ship, and the ship was an artificial intelligence. So the ship itself was intelligent, and a lot of it was written as if the story is told through their perspective. And again, just kind of opened my eyes, my imagination to like consciousness, and how, at what point does this intelligence become like a being? At what point do they have rights? I don't know, I can't even explain it, but these types of books really start to make me think, and in a very, I don't know, like out there. It's very wild, the types of ideas that they're saying, but again, they're grounded back in these messages that we can relate to today. Yes, we're in the very early stages of this kind of technology, but what happens in 100 years from now when technology like artificial intelligence is extremely intelligent? Like, at what point are they equal to us?
Yeah, well, it's weird. To me, there's this strange connection between sci-fi and sort of what we're talking about between the business students and the engineers that we were describing before.
Tell me how you're going to make this connection.
Well, so no, like sci-fi, you look at movies, you look at books, you look at all these things, and it's like, hey, this is what's possible. Like, what if this happened in the future?
The
what
pie
if we
in the sky
pie in the sky, right?
Yeah.
And then it's kind of up to engineers to say, oh, like, can we build that? How would we build that? Like, what are the prerequisites to get to that place? Like, is it even feasible? And then, you see technology go in different directions, but like, the cool thing is you need the inspiration to get to a certain point.
Yeah.
And the inspiration is what drives you to iterate or get to that kernel. And to me, that's such a cool thing, especially about science fiction, is that none of it is, some of it actually can be grounded in reality. I think they've gotten a lot better. Authors are so good at research now, and some of them are even experts. A
lot of these books go back to research.
Yeah.
They're talking about, like, they have studied to the point that they can, and a lot of it is backed by like scientific findings.
Yeah, and it's kind of cool to see, like, okay, this is what they think the future could look like. I read a bunch of books by, I think it's Michio Kaku.
Mm-hmm. Physics.
Yep, he's a physicist and a futurist who talks about how the world would be, and there's all these questions of like, okay, if you live forever, when would you get married? Right? I
read a book where he talked about that. We might have read this.
Probably.
The Future of Humanity.
Yeah, huge, like Physics of the Future of Humanity. I read a couple of his.
Yeah.
But they're very interesting questions. You're like, okay, well, if like I'm not worried about, like, if I could have kids at any time, even if I'm 500 years old.
Yeah.
If I could, if I'm going to be healthy and be able to do all of these things, like, is there a rush on some of these things? Like, the reason we do things at certain times in our life is because there's a sense of urgency because we're going to die, or there's other like biological things at play. Like, what if those aren't? Like, that fundamentally changes how humans are. Would we even do anything if we're going to live forever? Is there any motivation to do anything any day? No. And so like the philosophy of what could be possible in the future, to me, is also part of the fun of it. It's not just what could happen, it's like, how do we adapt to it? And I think that's going to inspire me to read some more science fiction.
I get a lot of inspiration from science fiction. And this also reminded me of I recently read a collection of contemporary Chinese sci-fi short stories, translated to English, obviously. I don't read Chinese, but there was one of the short stories. It was called Folding Beijing. So there's a lot of sci-fi it's rooted in messages of today, looking into how it could develop into the future. So this one called Folding Beijing, and it's a very famous short story in China. And it's about, in the future, they split the population into different groups. And you could consider it like low, middle, and high class. High class is maybe 5 million people. Then you have the middle class, 10 million, and the low class, let's say 25 million. They take the city of Beijing and they build it into foldable compartments. So the rich, the high class, which is only 5 million people, they will get 24 hours where their part of the city will unfold onto the land of Earth. And they will have a full 24 hours to enjoy the city and their time. Then after 24 hours, it folds up, and next will come middle class. They'll have 14 hours, and their part of the city will unfold. They'll enjoy, they'll work, whatever, folds back up. And then the next, 10 hours would open up the lower class, which is 25 million people. Trying to explain it, the story is it's very odd, but it's like the messages behind it. How this such a strong division of classes, what it turns into in the future, where they're building up these compartments and each of the classes doesn't interact with each other. And now it's to the point where the low class barely gets sunshine. They are on the earth for 10 hours and 8 of them are working. The other 2, they might be able to enjoy. Then they fold up and they're put under this sleeping spell. They don't wake up till a day later. I don't know, it's these odd messages that I get, but sometimes as well, it tells a lot about the society that we're driving today, and what could happen if we drive it to if we keep going in this direction, what it could mean for us.
I mean, in some sense, like in a very crude way, sci-fi authors or like anyone who's writing fiction, it's mostly sci-fi about the future, they are kind of like data scientists, right? They're taking a trend and they're like projecting it out and seeing what like could happen. And, just like us, we're probably wrong about most things, or like at least a lot of things. But the goal is to like think about the future and understand, okay, what are the implications of that? If the future is going to be like this, what do we do about it? Is that like a good outcome? Is that a bad outcome? How do we approach it? And what's our...
This was
our
addressing the like overpopulation. It was, what can we do if we don't have enough space for everyone on the earth? And it was to split the amount of time that people get on the earth. The rest of the time they would be folded up in these little compartments under like a sleeping spell. Then they would wake up and get their time. But it was addressing like the different classes as well as overpopulation, and using this new technology that they had developed to literally like make the city foldable.
Yeah, that's wild.
Yeah.
And then we have Elon Musk thinking that overpopulation, like underpopulation, is going to be the problem.
Which could be, yeah.
Which is fascinating.
Yeah.
Another futurist in his own right. So.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, Christina, those are all the questions I had. Is there anything you want to share about yourself, what you're working on, or how people can learn more about you to the audience?
First, I want you to share your book. What's one of the books that you learned the most from, or that made you have this wow moment?
So complete opposite.
Self-help.
Totally like quantifiable self-help. I've talked about this one a lot on the show, but it's called The One Thing. And I've been working on a lot of different things, and I've strayed from the path of the one thing this year. It's something I'm really trying to get back to. But essentially, like focusing all of your effort on a singular thing, it allows you to create incredible dividends from it and get that thing to scale and grow up to become something that can walk on its own, essentially.
So is this like specializing versus diversifying?
Correct. Yeah. Okay. So like, let's take content, for example, right? I spent a lot of time solely focusing on YouTube. That's all I would think about, essentially for a full year. And then like that content was able to eventually make money on its own. It eventually did very well and was shown all around the world. And from that, I had all these like other branches shoot out of it because there was so much of a critical mass there. And so like, rather than me spreading myself thin and trying to do like YouTube, LinkedIn, consulting, teaching, whatever it might be at the same time, if I'd done all those, I probably would have done them all and like they would have been okay, but they wouldn't have had branches come out of them individually. So YouTube is this one giant tree, but it's created all these different branches for me that I can choose to devote time to. But the tree itself is alive. It's going to be sustainable. It's going to be there. The small trees that I could make if I did a bunch of things at the same time, if I don't continue to water all of them, they'll probably like wither and die and they won't be self-sustaining. And so the idea is that with a one thing, if you focus on one thing, you can build this big and resilient thing. And that can create significantly more opportunities than spreading a little bit more thin because it is more reliable, it's more robust. I think it's important to diversify, but you diversify after you've established yourself in a trench in one area, which is a very like completely different philosophy than I was taking things with, because I was coming from
I think I'm in the same bucket of you prior.
Well, I was taking things from an engineering mindset where it's like divide and conquer.
Yeah.
If I do multiple things, like I can do them more efficiently and put them all back together at the end. And for better or for worse, that wasn't working for me quite as well as the one thing approach did.
Understandable.
Yeah.
I will check out the book because I haven't read it,
You'll like
and
it,
I
I
need.
think.
There's some lessons I can take.
It's like an unbelievably aesthetic book as well. It's pleasant to read.
Okay, that's good. That's good. I'll check it out.
Amazing.
And back to your question. So I shot you back a question. I mean, I don't have anything to close with other than, we've been talking about books now, so I encourage everyone tuning in, check out the hashtag Book a Week challenge and the hashtag Book a Month challenge, which is both on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is my most active platform. That's my social media of choice, let's say. So you can follow me there, connect there, follow the challenge and get involved, share your books that you're reading and the lessons that you're taking from them. And I look forward to seeing all of our listeners on LinkedIn and reading books.
Amazing. So I'll link Christina's LinkedIn in the description below. I will also, if I remember, try to link all the books that we recommended in this episode as well. I'm going to leave that up to Tony, my editor, to hopefully sneak in there. So Christina, thank you so much again. It was a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you for having me back.